Good evening and welcome to the National Federation Party live pre-budget panel discussion. Next Thursday, 29th June, the Fijian people and the world will hear the announcement of the Fiji First Government of their 4th year in power after winning the 2014 general elections. The announcement of the budget is arguably the single most important event in any annual parliamentary calendar. And as the Fijian people listen eagerly to learn how government plans for revenue measures and expenditure is going to affect their livelihood. More importantly, the 2017 to 2018 budget is an election budget. And there is an air of perhaps skepticism as to how the announcement will influence the electorate's opinion on how to vote in the general elections in 2018. And joining me here today is a panel of experts who will share with you their views on what they expect from the announcement, its impact on the nation at large as it readies itself for election in 2018. And first of all, let me introduce the panel to you, and I welcome all of them. Firstly, to my left, Professor Biman Prasad, the leader of the National Federation Party. Ms. Lorraine Foster, who is a professional accountant who has served in many senior capacities in regional organizations. And Ms. Foster is also a gender advocate. And to my right, my good friend, Professor Vijay Naidu of the University of the South Pacific. He's a widely published academic and a renowned social justice advocate. And of course, last but not least, Ms. Kula Bulamaibau, a young law graduate doing her GDLP and a concerned young person. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Well, let's start off by me asking you your views and opinion on how important a national budget is to a nation, particularly to Fiji at that, and the opportunities that you envision that could be gained or derived from a budget for nation building, as opposed to perhaps the intent of the government delivering the budget. Can I start with Professor Vijay Naidu?
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it's very critical that the budget reflects not only the government's priorities, but the priorities that the people deem to be important. And I completely agree with you that the national budget is indeed the most crucial parliamentary event in the calendar of parliamentary debates and discussions. So it's very important, it's very critical. The budget reflects the priorities of government, but is indicated by the people. I think that's very important. And in this regard, I'd like to make a number of comments. The first one is that the government's sources of revenue should be clearly enunciated. In recent years, what we have seen is movements away from progressive taxation to regressive taxation, including the imposition of VAT. Related to the sources of revenue, we want to ask the question, who carries the burden of taxation in the country, and whether or not it is time to look at the tax threshold and the sources of this revenue. The government should also clearly enunciate both the recurrent expenditure and the capital expenditure. And of course, capital expenditure is critical for growth. In this regard, I think, as we have seen in the recent past, the emphasis on infrastructure is important, but we want to see quality implementation of infrastructural projects. So it's one thing making the allocation, is another thing overseeing that this infrastructure that is being built is of quality. And other studies have shown, including one by Professor Biman Prasad, that over the years there has been a huge deficit in our infrastructure. Finally, Chairman, because I know there are so many other commentators here on the table, I'd like to pick one particular issue that for me is very central, and that relates to poverty alleviation, to a fundamental right, human right, and to social inclusiveness. And this is the business around social housing. The allocation to housing ministry and to housing generally in the previous budget, in my view, was grossly inadequate. Today we find that more than 20%, I believe it's close to 25% now, of Suva's urban population actually living in informal and squatter settlements. And we took Vakavanua arrangements, then we are looking at 30 to 40% of our people living in informal and insecure conditions. And I think if you have a well-meant policy, a well-designed policy in relation to housing, it will contribute to GDP growth, it will contribute to capacity building in terms of work relating to housing, house building, and it will also generate widespread employment. So I want to conclude there, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those very interesting comments, Vijay. I'll give the mic now to Ms. Bulamaibau, the young law graduate. From the perspective of an upcoming Fijian professional, what are your views on this particular issue?
Thank you, sir. First of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this panel. It's indeed a great honor, especially for someone like me who's very young and who just recently graduated. In my opinion, the budget of a particular country is important because as much as we'd like to say otherwise, money is what helps the country move. And it's what helps the country grow. And in Fiji particularly, there's been a lot of issues in relation to where the money is going and things of that sort. So our budget is, the next week Thursday is a very important day for us. It's because as taxpayers, we want to know where our money is going and what it's being used for. So I think it's very important, and for me as a young student who also is part of TELS, it's very, how do I put this? It's very, money is not something, because like I'm unemployed at the moment, I'm still in school. So the thought of having to go out there, look for a job, and then having to pay back for the money that I've used in relation to my education, it's daunting. So, and I think that's an important thing that I wanted to bring up was because in my view, I want to pay off my debt as soon as possible, but the whole idea of paying it off in a lump sum and getting a 200% penalty for that, it's very scary for me as a student. And so that's something that, I hope the government would, reconsider, and I hope the government would look at. Also, something that something that I've always been an advocate of is domestic violence. And I see that although the laws are in place, and this is the importance of the budget, it helps the enforcement of the particular laws that the parliament has passed. And in relation to enforcement of domestic violence, there's not much in our country. Although, the laws say that women should, domestic violence is irreconcilable, it's, and all these things. But if we don't have the mechanisms in place to enforce it, it's of no use. The law it doesn't mean anything if you don't enforce it. So I think that's something that I hope that the government would see, and I hope that the budget would bring forward, is to help enforce the laws and giving money towards the individual ministries, in this case the police force, to help the enforcement of certain laws, and in this particular case, domestic violence. So those are just a few things that I feel that are important, and I feel that which is why the budget is crucial.
Thank you, Kula. Professor Prasad, you have responded to so many budget speeches. We've heard all your comments and reactions to the ones that you have replied to. Your perspective on your expectations of a budget.
Thank you, President, and thank you to all the panelists for joining us this evening. A country's budget is a central political process where governments allocate expenditure against the revenue that they receive, and any shortfall in revenue is of course borrowed. And governments always come up with priorities, and if the priorities of the allocation of expenditure is not carefully thought out, it's not based on the central principle of good policy and how that good policy is going to impact on the quality of lives of people. If that is not the central principle in the allocation of the budget, then you can get the allocation terribly wrong. And the opportunity cost, for example, if appropriate sums are not allocated to a particular sector, and if that sector is very important, against an allocation to a sector which may not be a priority, but because it is politics, it is about votes, it is about campaign, you could have a situation where the allocation for a particular activity could be terribly wrong. For example, we have been raising this issue of allocation for kidney dialysis, and we said 9 million for playing golf as opposed to only 300,000 allocated to kidney dialysis or to other social expenditure is clearly a misallocation, is a missed opportunity to prioritize expenditure properly. So that in my view is very, very central in any kind of budget formulation, is that the government has to be very, very careful. It must not be driven by politics. It must not be driven by the next election. In fact, the budget allocation should be driven by priorities in various sectors where there is absolute need. My expectation of the budget, 2017-2018 budget, is primarily based on the fact that government has been told, especially by the National Federation Party in opposition and other parties in opposition, about a lot of issues. And let me try and predict what this budget might entail as a result of what has been brought to light over the last 2.5 years. The first, I think, is the sugar industry. The government has got it terribly wrong here. Over the last 8 or 9 years, sugar production has continued to decline, farmers' income has continued to decline, and the government has really very little idea as to how it can rejuvenate the industry, get the farmers back onto the farms. And the farmers have indicated very clearly their displeasure at the way in which the government handled the Reki meal saga, the way in which government has brought bills 19 and 20, and what it is proposing now. So it is possible. I'm expecting government to provide some subsidy to the farmers, such as subsidy to fertilizer and maybe some allocation for. So government would be responding to the issues in the sugar industry sector. I also think that the government will look at the health expenditure, because the health situation, the health facilities, the availability of health services, the availability of medicine has been a major issue. And the government knows this very well, because this has been well articulated by the opposition in Parliament and outside Parliament, and the people have come out and indicated this very, very clearly. So I am expecting an increase in expenditure for health, and there would be attempts to allocate expenditure in different sectors within the health ministry. One of the things that is unprecedented in this country is the increasing cost of living. I think people have come out very, very clearly and are saying to the government, saying to the politicians like us, that they cannot afford to live under such a rising cost of living. And I think part of this has been inflicted by deliberate government policies. In fact, the Fiji First government, Mr. President, you would remember very well, that in their manifesto, they promised that they will keep zero-rated VAT on basic food items. They have gone back on their words. In fact, they have put in 9% VAT on basic food items, although the overall VAT has been reduced from 15 to 9%. That may have some cushion. But the impact of 9% VAT on basic food items was a slap on the low-income families, and in fact a broken promise by this government. So I think that is an area that government is probably thinking, but I really don't think they have much, because you cannot change taxes every year. So I don't see an attempt to change taxes in this budget, particularly bringing back zero-rated VAT on basic food items. The final point I want to make, as I said earlier, when governments allocate expenditure, it is of course against the revenue they collect, but any shortfall in revenue is what is borrowed, which is the deficit. This is very significant. I mean, recently the World Bank kind of said that the level of debt that Fiji has right now is manageable. Yes, it may be manageable, but Vijay pointed out something very, very important. If a government is borrowing to finance the expenditure, of course it has to pay debt. And if you are paying debt back, you're paying it with interest and principal. And if I can just give you some statistics, the estimated debt as of July 2017 is about 5 billion. And the estimated repayment is about $436 million a year, of which about 267 million is just interest. Now, if you're paying roughly $500 million in repayment, you got to find that money. And what we have noticed over the last several years, while there's been a reduction in company tax, personal income tax, there's been a rise in indirect taxes. And Professor Naidu pointed out that very well, that any form of indirect taxation can be very, very regressive, and can be very regressive on the low-income people. So the people have to understand that while government is saying that they are allocating a large amount of expenditure on roads, and Vijay said, whether it's quality expenditure. In fact, governments engage in reckless spending partly for political reasons. And I think 2017-18 budget, as the President said quite rightly, is going to be an election budget. And I hope that this government, which is already engaging in some reckless spending, electioneering, openly, is not going to use 2017 and 18 budget to basically engage in reckless spending, because ultimately that would mean more borrowing, that would mean burdening further not only the future generation, but the current generation also has to pay in terms of increase in taxes. So I think that this budget can be a very tricky budget, tricky in the sense that if the government is genuinely concerned about the debt burden, if it is genuinely concerned about prioritizing expenditure into sectors where there is need, it will not engage in putting out a very, very political and election budget. But it will be engaging in responsible budgeting and making sure that it's able to reprioritize some of the expenditure to sectors where there is absolute need. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Prasad, for that very informative discussion. I want to draw the attention of the panel, particularly to some major areas of expenditure that came out on the last budget, and they're on the leaflet that there is before you. But I draw your attention particularly to, and talking about here, quality expenditure on the major areas that is required, and for the nation really to grow well, as you know, as alluded to by Professor Prasad and also by Professor Vijay Naidu. Roads in 2016-17, $500 million. Education, $448 million. Health, $244 million. The Fiji Police Force, $131 million. And the Fiji military forces at $96 million. Now, question, Lorraine, for you, and later on the members of the panel. I know that Vijay and also Professor Prasad have alluded to their expectation of what's going to be coming up next week, Thursday. But for you, Lorraine, what do you expect next week from the next week's budget announcement? Where do you expect significant increases, or where would you want to see the increases in expenditure across government's expenditure? And will there be surprises as far as you're concerned, Lorraine?
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank NFP for inviting me here this evening. Concerning government budgets, specifically Fiji, I really wouldn't like to use foul language live. But for me personally, the government budgets are window dressing. Just to give you an idea of who I am, 2 years ago, at the age of 54, I retired from work. So tonight, I'm not only speaking for myself, I'm speaking for women in general, and I'm also speaking for our aging population in Fiji, ideally those citizens that at the age of 55 years and over. As a matter of interest, about 19.1% of the total population was made up of aging citizens from the years 50 and over. And this was as at the end of 2016. The estimates came from the Bureau of Stats. So ideally, you're looking at 1/5 of the total population, which includes me and probably 4 of the members at this table. But it's been proven that the percentage is going to grow. So you're looking at, by the year 2050, every 1 to 5 people in 5 people will be over the age of 60. So you're looking at the population dynamics changing. And our governments, and even governments around the world, should be prepared to handle this aging population. And they need to start now. Currently, the government budgets, they're too general. The figures they bring out, it's showing for all citizens of Fiji. So it's difficult for us to assess any disparities in gender, in age, or even in some cases, races as well too. For us, the aging population in Fiji, I believe we've contributed greatly towards our family. Most of us have worked a minimum of 10 years to 20 years. Some of us have worked 30 years and over. So ideally, we've also contributed to our communities, and above all, we've also contributed to the economy of Fiji. So ideally, we've paid our dues to our country. And what we expect in return is for our government to reciprocate and ensure that the aging population and, of course, the women in Fiji are still part of their so-called vision and mission. And this should be reflected in the budgets. As Professor Biman mentioned, the budget allocation, it's actually a joke. Education for 2017, we were looking at around about 26 million, as compared to the Fiji military forces, where their budget for 2017 came to around about 96 million. Some of our citizens are getting really paranoid about this 96.4 million. I mean, seriously, is our country really under security threat from our local citizens, or maybe our Pacific Island neighbors, or maybe other international forces? This budget is actually quite worrying. After years of political discomfort, I believe that we, the citizens of Fiji, we've proven over and over again that we're actually a peaceful people. So I don't think we need that extra security to maintain peace in Fiji. For our aging population, we're recommending in the 2018 budget that the Fiji Military Forces budget decreases by at least 20%. And this 20% should be reallocated to the Ministry for Social Services. Currently, the retirement age for Fiji is at 55, and yet the pensions currently being paid out to our aging population starts at, I think, the age of 65. So you have a gap of at least 10 years. So we are pleading and demanding to government that at least 20% of the budget for the military decrease and be reallocated to the Fiji military forces. Now, what's frightening is, for us accountants, a budget is a guideline of how funds should be used. But for government budgets, it's actually passed through Parliament, and it's law. So therefore, the divisions should be held accountable for the allocated funds that's been given to them. Like I said, the government budget, it's too general. It doesn't tell us. It needs to be more detailed. It needs to tell us how much is allocated gender-wise, age-wise, and even in some cases, race-wise as well. So I'll just hand the mic back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lorraine. I know we're getting caught up with time. I'll pass the mic now to Kula. Generally on that question, very briefly, you're a young law graduate, a young person who's got the world ahead of you. What are your expectations? What do you want out of the announcement next week?
Thank you. Basically, what I want is a budget that not only prioritizes, as all the other panelists have said, prioritizes the important things to our society, things that would actually help our society grow, from the sugar industry to the aging population, as Ms. Lorraine has mentioned. These are things that should be prioritized in our society. And as a student, you know, I'm one of the lucky ones because I only got on the TELS loan scheme during my third year of law school. So my loan would only be around 20,000. But there are students that have started from their first year and they have at least 40,000 in loans to pay back. And I had a cousin who actually graduated from law school, and when she started working, she was only getting paid $100 per week. So if you compare this to the loan that we have to pay back, it's not proportionate. So what I expect, or what I hope that the government would look at, is to reconsider the loan scheme and give out more scholarships to students who actually deserve it, compared to the only 600 students. They could have they could give more to students, because the students that you're funding for now, they're going to be the ones that are going to look after the country in the future. They're going to be the ones paying for the debts that this current government has been accumulating over the years. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kula. I'll hand the mic now to Professor Prasad. I know you've alluded to a few issues earlier in terms of what you you want to see coming up from the next budget. If you would just like elaborate a little bit more with some other concluding remarks from your end.
Yeah, thank you, President. I think there is one other thing that has happened in the economy over the last 10 or 11 years. And that is the wages and salaries have not kept pace with the rising cost of living. In fact, in many sectors, there's been hardly increase in salaries and wages. So what I know is that the civil servants are very unhappy, the teachers are very unhappy. I know that some corporate organizations are receiving salary increases, and that's probably the right thing to do, because many of those organizations, and including the civil servants, teachers, nurses, have not had salary rises commensurate with the cost of living over the last 10 years. So, for example, if teachers get, assuming that teachers get a 30% salary rise in the next budget, and I suspect that the government will try and address some of those civil service statutory organization salaries. But that would be the right thing to do, because it will be just a catch-up. For example, if teachers get a 30% pay rise, that would mean an average of 3% increase for the last 10 years. But the real issue is those on low income. And I don't think the government has any idea as to what it wants to do with respect to the wages and salaries in the low-income section of the population and those who are employed. And this is why we are advocating a living wage. In other words, it should be possible for a family, for an individual, to work for a week and earn enough to be able to cater for him or herself or the family. And that is the concept of living wage. And that is why the National Federation Party is proposing a living wage of $200 per week, because we believe that that is what is going to deal with the issue. So really we need to look at, and I'm hoping that there would be specific policies within the budget to address issues of unemployment, especially unemployment among the youth, among the graduates and those coming out of tertiary institutions, but also those getting out are able to get commensurate salaries with the cost of living. So I think that would be a very difficult proposition for government in this budget, and I suspect the easier thing for government to do would be to allocate expenditure and engage in electioneering through handouts. And this would be a very short-term, a short-sighted attempt to go into an election with a budget that is likely to please a lot more people than, in fact, addressing the real issues in the economy.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. By way of final remarks on this particular issue, before I sum up, I know we are being caught up with time. I would like to give the mic now to Professor Naidu on the question that is before us, and you have heard what's been aired by our colleagues, along the table. Your thoughts, please.
Very quickly, Chair, I've got 5 comments, on what has been said. The first one, Professor Prasad has been talking about cost of living. Of course, it entails food items, but it also includes rentals, for accommodation and housing prices. I dare say now the price of housing in many urban areas are beyond, the capacity of ordinary wage earners in the country. So we need to address that. Secondly, I completely agree with the idea of providing subsidies in agriculture generally and in sugar cane production particularly. We got to incentivize the farmers. This is a very important productive sector where we have comparative advantage. And for years I've been seeing farmers suffer floods, droughts, commodity price fluctuations, and every risk is put on the farmer. So, what can we as a nation do to ensure that farming is, the risks related to farming actually is reduced? And again, that's a policy matter. I agree completely with Lorraine about the need to desegregate the budget. If you audit the budget and say what is going to youth, then you find actually very little is going to youth, especially out of school youth. If you audit the budget and say, what about old people? And you find similar issues there. And of course, Lorraine has mentioned women. 2 retrograde decisions made by this government, self-serving, were, 1, the retirement age in the public service brought down to 55. It's an attack on elderly people. And I think it sent a lot more people to death earlier than one would have anticipated. The second one was, of course, giving themselves these huge salary increases and other perks at a time when, we have a minimum wage of $2.30 for people who are not, the most vulnerable of our workers. I also support Lorraine's position on the budget for our security forces. If you aggregated the budget for the security forces, we're looking at more than 330 million a year. If you put everything together, the police, the military, the prisons, peacekeeping duties, etc., etc. And I believe for a small country, this is excessive. My final point, Chair, is that we, the government and society at large, really needs to look at the most vulnerable members of our society. And Biman has mentioned some of them, and so has our young panelists with respect to youth. Social protection measures include measures relating to the labor market. Young people need to be trained. Not only formal academic training, but training relating to skills. And it's a responsibility of the government to ensure that they are trained. This training is supported and the burden doesn't fall on the families alone. So if you want a skilled labor force that is productive, then social protection for the youth entails such education and training. So I think that's my final point. I think the youth are very important. And I think as it stands, if you do an audit for youth out of school, I think the allocation by the government in terms of its budget is rather low. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much for those comments, Professor Naidu. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, time has caught up with us. But you have heard all the very interesting ideas and true and factual ideas that have been put to you by the panel of today's discussion in anticipation of the budget next week. A call for desegregation of the budget, responding to the needs of our community, not at large, but specifically targeting the areas that are in need. And of course, then there is suggestions that areas where budget had been allocated to abundantly in the past could then be rediverted to address the immediate needs of the elderly, of the youth, of women, of the cane farmers. And we hope that this is going to be the reflection of the budget that comes out next week, and I hope that the minister is listening and the government is listening tonight, and because this is really reflecting what the people have to say, and that for them it's not necessarily vote buying, but whatever is responding to their needs right now. So, and now that brings me then to the conclusion of our discussion here tonight, and I would like to thank our panelists here tonight. Lorraine Foster, thank you very much. Professor Naidu from the University of the South Pacific. And of course, our young upcoming leader and a young law graduate, Ms. Kula Bulamaibau, and Professor Biman Prasad, the leader of the National Federation Party. And I thank you all for listening in tonight and your interest in this discussion. I invite you all also to continue to join us next week on Thursday, the 29th, as the budget is delivered from here at the office of the National Federation Party, where we will bring to you a running commentary of the budget with another group of panelists. And I hope that we will share with you, our honest thoughts in terms of where the budget is going to take us from next week onward when it is announced and what the people think of it. So once again, thank you to the panelists, and I thank you all for listening to this panel. Thank you.